let's take a look at how we cut angles in the workshop. First thing we want to do is get our pieces cut to the appropriate size, length, using the appropriate thickness of wood. The angle, you should know in how many degrees, you should know what the angle is. Use a protractor to help you figure that out. Otherwise, like if you made a technical drawing, it should say in your technical drawing. But we should definitely know what the angle is that we need. And then what's very important, what I need you to do is I need you to draw the angle on how you're cutting it. So for example, let's say on this piece, I'm going to cut an angle on both sides of the piece. Now, what I need to do and what I need you to do is draw that angle on each side of the piece of wood. It'll make sense in a little bit because it has to do with how you place the wood on the machine and how we set up the angle and so on. It's just going to help us mentally setting stuff up correctly if we have the angle on both pieces. So draw it correctly. Now notice on this side, I drew it correctly. I want to show you a common problem. Let's say that's how it's supposed to be here, but the person, they had a brain issue and they drew it wrong. So if you look, that doesn't make sense how I drew that there. Common issue. So you got to think that through. Doing angle stuff requires a little bit more thinking. So you got to think that through. If you're doing a piece like this, well, actually, let me tell you real quick. The protractors, there are some plastic bin on top of that black cabinet in the hand drawing kind of tool section. Anyway, if I'm cutting something like this, if I'm doing angle cuts on a piece that's like this low, then I can easily use the miter saw to do that. If I'm doing something that's taller, and notice that's pretty short, this would not be safe to do on the miter saw, so I'd have to use the table saw for that. To set up the miter saw, now, you'd set it up like this. Now notice, I don't want to angle the miter saw this way because I'm going to be holding it with my left hand. So what I'd want to do is angle it away from my hand. The way that I do this, I loosen this. There's a little lever here. Push that, and then I can set my degrees. I think this is close to like 17 or I don't know, something like that. So then I'll lock this in. Notice it doesn't match my drawing. That's why I drew it on both sides. So now when I flip it over, now it matches. And when I'm using the miter saw, I would, without pulling the trigger, I would bring it down to get like lined up, get myself lined up, and then I do my normal miter saw procedures. Before you cut at an angle, with a miter saw or a table saw, you got to call me over. So like, let's say you got to this point, you're set up, you're kind of ready to cut, then you call me over. Say, hey, Mr. Cooper, I'm ready to cut this piece at a diagonal. Anytime you do a diagonal, you got to call me over. I just want to make sure everything's set up good and you're being safe. We never, ever, ever cut a cylinder at an angle with the miter saw. So just keep that in mind. But again, anyway, for procedures here, you can get the machine set up, but before you cut, you call me over and have me double check your setting. So let's say, okay, well let's say you can't use the miter saw for your piece because it's more like this. So then we go to the table saw. I kind of already did some adjustments here. Now here's one of the tricky parts about the table saw and kind of doing angles. It's great when we can use the fence because it helps us be really precise. But you have to keep in mind that this fence, the setting here, is to where the bottom of the blade is. So the setting of the fence is to the bottom of the blade, not to the top of the blade. So I can't just set the fence. Let's say my piece is 7 inches long. I can't just set the fence to 7 inches long. What I actually have to do is I'd have to set the fence to where my fingernail is, where that bottom of that angle, I drew the line there. This line you don't need to draw. But I put a question mark there because like, well, what is that distance? When we're dealing with angles, then you got a little bit more math involved. And if you haven't done geometry, then it's just some of this stuff is kind of like, well, how do you calculate this? In terms of us, for the stuff that we're making and the amount of time that we have, I'm going to show you some tips on how we can do that without having to really calculate all that. But if you do have a technical drawing, if you design these parts on the computer and you have a technical drawing, then you should be able to get this exact distance. Well, and then you just set the table saw to that number. So that's the precise, like that's the best case scenario. Hopefully you have a technical drawing, you made it on the computer, and then you know that exact distance. You can then set it on the table saw. That's perfect. But let's say we didn't do that. Then what we can do is we can kind of just, I'm going to show you, I don't want to say just eyeball it, but we're going to get very, very close. So now, in terms of setting up the saw, again, you need permission to do this, so you can't just go start doing this. You gotta come get me, ask me. I got the power off. I put the guard up. This crank over here is how we adjust the angle. Notice on the front of the table saw here, we have the degrees. I've already got it at like 17. Very important for adjusting our table saw. You have to lefty-loosey on these black knobs, and then you can crank it. If you don't do that, that can damage the table saw. You really have to make sure you're being responsible with that. The same thing with the blade height. This crank is for the height, which you may or may not have to raise the blade height, depending on what kind of angle you're cutting. But anyway, so again, we loosen the black knob, and then we can crank. Once you have it in the correct spot, then you can very lightly tighten that black knob. They don't really need to get that tight. So let's say I got my fence, or my blade at the appropriate angle. I knew my degrees. It was 17. I set the saw to 17. We also have these digital angle finders if you want to try and be more precise, but a lot of times this is plenty good for us. So now, imagine looking down here and squinting one eye, and you're trying to line up this corner of this board right here with the surface of the tooth up here. And it's better if you watch what I do here. I'm trying to be very precise. I'm going to go too far. If I go too far, that's not good. We don't want to start too far because we're not going to glue the sawdust back on. But if we start, I'll give you the opposite here. Notice I definitely have a gap there. If I start not far enough, well, I can always fix that by bumping the fence a little bit further. So again, if I can be really precise with knowing this number, that is awesome. But if I cannot be that precise, then for us, usually what we're doing is we're just trying to get the top edge, the top front corner of this edge in line with the blade. So like right about there. Now, depending on what you're doing, if you're like, oh, I'm doing, notice this only goes to 45. If you're doing an angle like 60 or something like that, we got some different adjustments or different kind of positioning we have to do. Like sometimes we might have to turn the board over and do like a cut over here depending on the piece of wood. Sometimes we got to do funky stuff like use like a jig and hold the piece up. But anyway, you do not have permission to just go and start cutting a piece at an angle. This is more dangerous. Anytime you're doing an angle cut, you call me over, have me double check your setting. Make sure, again, you got to have the power off. Make sure you have me double check your setting, and then I can help also guide you, because like some of this stuff, okay, well, do I use the fence to push this through, or do I use the miter gauge? Like some of that stuff, I got to help you make decisions on some of those things. So, but you can get the machine set up with the power off and then have me come check it.